Hi, welcome back to Unit 3, Punctuation. This is Lesson 4, Quotation Marks. You'll find this information in your textbook on pages HB 87 through HB 91. Quotation marks may indicate a title, a quote, or dialogue. In college writing, you'll use quotation marks frequently to acknowledge when you've taken words from others. But there are some instances when quotation marks are not appropriate, but we'll get to that in a minute. Use quotation marks to enclose direct quotations, the words spoken or written by others. Nothing against Tom, but Johnny may be the bigger star now, says director John Waters. The quote marks tell us that Sean Smith is relating the exact words John Waters used when he was talking about Johnny Depp. Newt Gingrich and Jesse Jackson have both pounded nails and raised funds for Habitat for Humanity. This is what Millard Fuller calls the theology of the hammer. In this case, the quotation marks denote a particular phrase written or spoken by Millard Fuller that Diana George is applying to this situation. Quotes require speaker tags or signal phrases such as he said or she claimed or the author writes. When the speaker tag is in front of the quote, put a comma after the verb and capitalize the first word of the quote if it's a complete sentence. When the speaker tag or signal phrase comes after the quote, use a comma before the closing quotation mark, unless the quote is a question or an exclamation. When my mother reported that Mr. Tomke did not believe in television, my father said, "Well, good for him. I don't know that I believe in it either." "That's exactly how I feel," my mother said, and then my parents watched the news and whatever came on after the news. Sedaris shows us both a speaker tag or signal phrase introducing a quote and one interrupting a quote. You don't need any punctuation between that and a quotation, nor do you need to capitalize the first word of the quote. We were assigned to write one essay agreeing or disagreeing with George Orwell's statement that the slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. In dialogue, insert a new paragraph and a new pair of quotation marks to signal each change of speaker. "What's this?" the hospital janitor said to me as he stumbled over my right shoe. "My shoes?" I said. "That's not a shoe, brother," he replied, holding it to the light. "That's a brick." You can see in this example how the author indents the beginning of each new speaker's line and uses quotation marks to show which words are dialogue and which are narration. A long quote is treated differently than shorter ones. And because English is fun, what's considered long varies depending on your formatting guidelines. Generally, however, all of the style guides require long quotes to be set off as block quotes without quotation marks. The MLA style guide, which considers a long quote to be 5 or more lines of text, stipulates that a block quote be indented a ½ inch or 5 spaces from the left margin. This example is a representation of an MLA block quote. Besides the indentation and the lack of quotation marks, notice that the citation is handled differently than for shorter quotes. The end punctuation goes directly after the final word of the quote, followed by the citation in parentheses with no other end punctuation. A title enclosed in quotation marks means it's a short work that is usually part of a larger whole. These short works include articles, chapters, essays, short stories, poems, songs, and TV episodes. The larger whole that they're part of should be italicized rather than enclosed in quote marks. In Unfriendly Skies Are No Match for El Al, Vivian Walt, a writer for USA Today, describes her experience flying with this airline. The quotation marks go around the article's title, not just in the sentence, but in the attribution too. The paper that ran the article is italicized. Our second example: with every page of Edgar Allan Poe's story, The Telltale Heart, my own heart beat faster, demonstrates quote marks around a short story's title. The third example shows a poem's title. Rita Dove's poem, Dawn Revisited, contains vivid images that appeal to the senses of sight, sound, smell, and taste. So, how, you may ask, do you handle a quote within a quote? That's what the single quote marks are for. Here we have Deborah Johnson quoting Marilyn Adams, who's quoting someone else about teaching reading. So she uses single quote marks around the phrase direct instruction in phonics, focusing on the orthographic regularities of English. The second example includes two essay titles. Instead of the usual double quotation marks, the author uses singles to indicate the titles are used within the context of a quote. When other punctuation follows material in quotation marks, it goes inside the closing mark sometimes and outside in others, which depends on how the quotation is being used. Commas and periods generally go inside the closing quote marks. I learned it this way: commas and periods are too small to be outside all by themselves. Examples of this are pretty easy to find since commas and periods are common. On the newsstand, the cover is acting as a poster, an ad for what's inside, comma, she said. The loyal reader is looking for what makes the magazine exceptional, period, close quotation mark. Semicolons and colons that are not part of the quote go outside the closing quotation mark. In this first example, Carter is giving a series of examples, the first of which is a quote. Folks have fought and died for your right to pierce your face, so do it right. He separates the first list item from the second with the semicolon that is outside the quote mark because it's not part of the quote. The second item ends with right in quotation marks. Again, the semicolon goes on the outside because it's not part of the quote. Because semicolons and colons are not in marks, they always go outside. This example uses a quote. It depends. The colon indicates that what follows is an explanation or amplification of the quote. The colon is not part of the quote, so it goes on the outside. Although it's a good idea to avoid exclamation points altogether, this same inside-outside rule applies to them as well as to question marks. Their location depends on whether they are part of the quote or not. Because they're end punctuation, it's kind of a case-by-case call. Here, Amy Tan's character in Mother Tongue is asking a question as part of her dialogue, so the question mark goes inside the quote mark. However, this is a question that includes the title of a song, which is part of the question, but it's not the question itself. A couple of slides back, I said periods generally go inside the closing quotation mark. One exception to that rule is in-text citations or parenthetical documentation for shorter quotes. Because the citation in the parentheses is part of the sentence, but not part of the quote, it goes outside the closing quote mark, and the sentence's end punctuation follows. An avid baseball fan, Tallulah Bankhead, once said, "There have been only two geniuses in the world, Willie Mays and Willie Shakespeare." Bankhead's words, ending with Shakespeare, are enclosed in quote marks. The 183 in parentheses tells the reader that this quote came from page 183 of the source material, which is included in the sentence and followed by a period. Quotation marks aren't appropriate for every situation. For example, don't use them to identify a slang term, as the writer does here. Appearing hip is important to many parents in New York. And of course, they're unnecessary with indirect quotes, as demonstrated in this example. Grandmother always said that meat that was any good didn't need seasoning. There's another common and correct use of quotation marks to indicate irony or sarcasm. There are several kinds of irony, and I don't want to dive into that rabbit hole just now. So, for our purposes here, let's define irony as the gap between expectation and reality, or when you get the opposite of what you expected. Sarcasm is using irony to mock or attack someone. Verbally, a speaker's tone tells you when they're using irony or sarcasm. In writing, however, we use quotation marks to indicate we mean the opposite of what our words are saying. This is a correct use of quotation marks. When a reader sees quote marks around words that aren't a quote, they correctly question the writer's meaning and assume he means the opposite of what his words are saying. As in this example, with my big presentation only a week away, my rival offered to help me. I assumed she meant she wanted to help me over a cliff. Unfortunately, sometimes people use quotation marks for emphasis. However, this usually has the opposite effect. For example, this sign advertising a professional massage. It makes me wonder what this professional is really offering. This ophthalmologist sign makes me question just what kind of an eye doctor he or she is. I'm not sure I want them anywhere near my eyes. Does this sign mean their burgers are covered in that nasty yellow melted plastic cheese food that they have at the gas station? Because cheese is so sus. I'm not even sure where to go with this one. Do I need to tell the technician I'm not pregnant, just fat? Or that I'm not fat, just pregnant? I don't even know. When I saw this sign, my first thought was, have you seen a doctor about those? If I eat at your restaurant, will I have to see a doctor? Is this really the kind of condition you want to shout from a banner in front of your place of business? What did your wife say when she found out? Did you get them from that professional massage? I can go on and on. Here's a sign for another medical professional I hope is better at his or her job than they are at grammar. This doc is a real plastic surgeon. This sign is telling me this is where you go if you want to wind up on an episode of Botched. I wonder if this sign is hanging on the door of a storage unit because that's where those real plastic surgeons work. There's also something disconcerting about the contradiction of real plastic. I'm pretty sure this doctor's intent was to drum up more business, not make people turn away in fear. I didn't know Jen and Ted South, and based on this plaque, I'm kind of glad about that, since they were nice. Nice people are the ones that offer to help you over a cliff. Or worse, share their crabs while recommending a real plastic surgeon. This sign warns us about a gunshot in Act 3. This is the kind of shot John Wilkes Booth fired at Abraham Lincoln. That one was blank too. And finally, this children's book where Timmy takes a road trip with Officer Sandusky and is never seen or heard from again. Timmy, the quotation marks around officer should have told you this was going to be a one-way trip. Don't be Timmy. Avoid quotation marks used for emphasis, like Officer Sandusky is at the wheel. In Lesson 4, we talked about using quotation marks around direct quotes and not using them with long quotes. However, they are used with titles of short works, while single quotes are used for a quote within a quote. We talked about how periods and commas generally go inside quotation marks, and semicolons and colons go outside. But with quotation marks, it depends on how they're being used. And of course, don't use quote marks for slang, indirect quotes, and especially not for emphasis. Be sure to check Canvas for quotation mark quizzes and join me for our next Grammar Odyssey when we'll have fun with apostrophes. If you have questions, shoot me an email. Thanks for stopping by. And I want to give a shout out to Slides Carnival and Unsplash for designing my slides template. Thanks to them, I can focus on content without worrying about format. See you next time for Lesson 5, Apostrophes.